Everything was arranged by the time Laurie returned with a note from Aunt March enclosing the desired sum. The short afternoon wore away. All the other errands were done, and Meg and her mother busy at some necessary needlework, while Beth and Amy got tea, and Hannah finished her ironing with what she called a slap and a bang, but still Joe did not come. They began to get anxious, and Laurie went off to find her, for no one ever knew what freak Joe might take into her head. He missed her, however, and she came walking in with a very queer expression of countenance, for there was a mixture of fun and fear, satisfaction and regret in it, which puzzled the family as much as did the roll of bills she laid before her mother, saying with a little choke in her voice, "That's my contribution toward making Father comfortable and bringing him home." "My dear, where did you get it?" $25, Joe. I hope you haven't done anything rash."
"No, it's mine, honestly. I didn't beg, borrow, or steal it. I earned it. And I don't think you'll blame me, for I only sold what was my own."
As she spoke, Joe took off her bonnet, and a general outcry arose, for all her abundant hair was cut short.
"Your hair! Your beautiful hair!"
"Oh, Joe, how could you? Your one beauty!" "My dear girl, there was no need of this."
"She doesn't look like my Joe anymore, but I love her dearly for it." "What made you do it?"
asked Amy, who would as soon have thought of cutting off her head as her pretty hair.
"Well, I was wild to do something for Father,"
replied Joe as they gathered about the table, for healthy young people can eat even in the midst of trouble.
"I hate to borrow as much as Mother does, and I knew Aunt March would croak. She always does if you ask her for a 9-pence. Meg gave all her quarterly salary toward the rent, and I only got some clothes with mine, so I felt wicked and was bound to have some money if I sold the nose off my face to get it."
"You needn't feel wicked, my child. You had no winter things and got the simplest with your own hard earnings," said Mrs. March with a look that warmed Joe's heart.
"I hadn't the least idea of selling my hair at first, but as I went along I kept thinking what I could do, and feeling as if I'd like to dive into some of the rich stores and help myself. In a barber's window I saw tails of hair with the prices marked, and one black tail, not so thick as mine, was $40. It came over me all of a sudden that I had one thing to make money out of, and without stopping to think, I walked in, asked if they bought hair, and what they would give for mine."
"Didn't you feel dreadfully when the first cut came?" asked Meg with a shiver.
"I took a last look at my hair while the man got his things, and that was the end of it. I never snivel over trifles like that. I will confess, though, I felt queer when I saw the dear old hair laid out on the table and felt only the short rough ends of my head. It almost seemed as if I'd an arm or a leg off. The woman saw me look at it and picked out a long lock for me to keep. I'll give it to you, Marmee, just to remember past glories by, for a crop is so comfortable I don't think I shall ever have a mane again."
Mrs. March folded the wavy chestnut lock and laid it away with a short gray one in her desk. She only said, "Thank you, dearie." But something in her face made the girls change the subject and talk as cheerfully as they could about Mr. Brooks' kindness, the prospect of a fine day tomorrow, and the happy times they would have when Father came home to be nursed. No one wanted to go to bed when at 10 o'clock Mrs. March put by the last finished job and said, "Come, girls." Beth went to the piano and played the father's favorite hymn. All began bravely, but broke down one by one, till Beth was left alone singing with all her heart, for to her music was always a sweet consoler. "Go to bed and don't talk, for we must be up early, and she'll need all the sleep we can get. Good night, my darlings," said Mrs. March as the hymn ended, for no one cared to try another. They kissed her quietly, and went to bed as silently as if the dear invalid lay in the next room. Beth and Amy soon fell asleep in spite of the great trouble, but Meg lay awake, thinking the most serious thoughts she had ever known in her short life. Joe lay motionless, and her sister fancied that she was asleep, till a stifled sob made her exclaim as she touched a wet cheek, "Joe, dear, what is it? Are you crying about Father?"
"No, not now."
"What then?"
My hair!"
burst out poor Joe, trying vainly to smother her emotion in the pillow. It did not sound at all comical to Meg, who kissed and caressed the afflicted heroine in the tenderest manner.
"I'm not sorry," protested Joe with a choke. "I'd do it again tomorrow if I could. It's only the vain, selfish part of me that goes and cries in this silly way. Don't tell anyone. It's all over now. I thought you were asleep, so I just made a little private moan for my one beauty. How came you to be awake?" "I can't sleep, I'm so anxious," said Meg. "Think about something pleasant, and you'll soon drop off." "I tried it, but felt wider awake than ever." "What do you think of?" "Handsome faces. Eyes, particularly," answered Meg, smiling to herself in the dark. "What color do you like the best?" "Brown. That is, sometimes. Blue are lovely."
Joe laughed, and Meg sharply ordered her not to talk, then amiably promised to make her hair curl, and fell asleep to dream of living in her castle in the air. The clocks were striking midnight, and the rooms were very still as a figure glided quietly from bed to bed, smoothing a coverlid here, settling a pillow there, and pausing to look long and tenderly at each unconscious face, to kiss each with lips that mutely blessed, and to pray the fervent prayers which only mothers utter. As she lifted the curtain to look out into the dreary night, the moon broke suddenly from behind the clouds, and shone upon her like a bright, benignant face, which seemed to whisper in the silence, "Be comforted, dear soul. There is always light behind the clouds." In the cold gray dawn the sisters lit their lamp and read their chapter with an earnestness never felt before. For now the shadow of a real trouble had come, the little books were full of help and comfort, and as they dressed, they agreed to say good-bye cheerfully and hopefully, and send their mother on her anxious journey unsaddened by tears or complaints from them. Laurie and his grandfather came over to see her off, and Mr. Brooke looked so strong and sensible and kind that the girls christened him Mr. Greatheart on the spot. "Goodbye, my darlings. God bless and keep us all," whispered Mrs. March, as she kissed one dear little face after the other and hurried into the carriage. As she rolled away, the sun came out, and looking back, she saw it shining on the group at the gate like a good omen. They saw it also, and smiled and waved their hands, and the last thing she beheld as she turned the corner was the 4 bright faces, and behind them like a bodyguard, old Mr. Lawrence, faithful Hannah, and devoted Laurie. "How kind everyone is to us," she said, turning to find fresh proof of it in the respectful sympathy of the young man's face. "I don't see how they can help it," returned Mr. Brooke, laughing so infectiously that Mrs. March could not help smiling. And so the long journey began with the good omens of sunshine, smiles, and cheerful words. News from their father soon comforted the girls very much, for though dangerously ill, the presence of the best and tenderest of nurses had already done him good. Mr. Brooke sent a bulletin every day, and as the head of the family, Meg insisted on reading the dispatches, which grew more and more cheering as the week passed. For a week the amount of virtue in the old house would have supplied the neighborhood. It was really amazing, for everyone seemed in a heavenly frame of mind, and self-denial was all the fashion. Relieved of their first anxiety about their father, the girls insensibly relaxed their praiseworthy efforts a little, and began to fall back into the old ways. They did not forget their motto, but hoping and keeping busy seemed to grow easier, and after such tremendous exertions, they felt that endeavor deserved a holiday, and gave it a good many. All were unconscious that this experience was a test of character, and when the first excitement was over, felt that they had done well and deserved praise. So they did, but their mistake was in ceasing to do well, and they learned this lesson through much anxiety and regret.
"Meg, I wish you'd go and see the Hummels. You know Mother told us not to forget them,"
said Beth 10 days after Mrs. March's departure.
"I'm too tired to go this afternoon,"
replied Meg, rocking comfortably as she sewed.
"Can't you, Joe?"
asked Beth.
"Too stormy for me with my cold." "I thought it was almost well."
"It's well enough for me to go out with Laurie, but not well enough to go to the Hummels," said Joe, laughing, but looking a little ashamed of her inconsistency. "Why don't you go yourself?" asked Meg.
"I have been every day, but the baby is sick, and I don't know what to do for it. Mrs. Hummel goes away to work, and Lutchen takes care of it, but it gets sicker and sicker, and I think you or Hannah ought to go."
Beth spoke earnestly, and Meg promised she would go tomorrow.
"Ask Hannah for some nice little mess and take it round, Beth. The air will do you good," said Joe, adding apologetically, "I'd go, but I want to finish my writing." "My head aches and I'm tired, so I thought maybe some of you would go," said Beth. "Amy will be in presently, and she will run down for us," suggested Meg. "Well, I'll rest a little and wait for her."
So Beth lay down on the sofa, the others returned to their work, and the Hummels were forgotten. An hour passed. Amy did not come. Meg went to her room to try on a new dress. Jo was absorbed in her story, and Hannah was sound asleep before the kitchen fire when Beth quietly put on her hood, filled her basket with odds and ends for the poor children, and went out into the chilly air with a heavy tread and a grieved look in her patient eyes. It was late when she came back, and no one saw her creep upstairs and shut herself into her mother's room. Half an hour after, Jo went to Mother's closet for something, and there found Beth sitting on the medicine chest, looking very grave, with red eyes and a camphor bottle in her hand.
"Christopher Columbus, what's the matter?"
cried Jo, as Beth put out her hand as if to warn her off, and asked quickly,
"You've had the scarlet fever, haven't you?" "Years ago, when Meg did. Why?" "Then I'll tell you. Oh, Jo, the baby's dead." "What baby?" "Mrs. Hummel's. It died in my lap before she got home,"
cried Beth with a sob.
"My poor dear, how dreadful for you. I ought to have gone,"
said Jo, taking her sister in her arms as she sat down in her mother's big chair with a remorseful face.
"I just sat and held it softly till Mrs. Hummel came with the doctor. He said it was dead, and looked at Heinrich and Minna, who've got sore throats. 'Scarlet fever, ma'am. Ought to have called me before,' he said crossly. Mrs. Hummel told him she was poor and had tried to cure the baby herself, but now it was too late, and she could only ask him to help the others and trust to charity for his pay. He smiled then and was kinder, but it was very sad, and I cried with him till he turned round all of a sudden and told me to go home and take belladonna right away or I'd have the fever." "No, you won't," cried Jo, hugging her close with a frightened look. "Oh, Beth, if you should be sick, I never could forgive myself. What shall we do?" "Don't be frightened. I guess I shan't have it badly. I looked in Mother's book and saw that it begins with headache, sore throat, and queer feelings like mine. So I did take some belladonna, and I feel better,"
said Beth, laying her cold hands on her hot forehead and trying to look well.
"If Mother was only home!"
exclaimed Jo, seizing the book and feeling that Washington was an immense way off. She read a page, looked at Beth, felt her head, peeped into her throat, and then said gravely, "You've been over the baby every day for more than a week, and among the others who are going to have it. So I'm afraid you are going to have it, Beth. I'll call Hannah. She knows all about sickness." "Don't let Amy come. She never had it, and I should hate to give it to her. Can't you and Meg have it over again?" asked Beth anxiously. "I guess not. Don't care if I do. Served me right, selfish pig, to let you go and stay writing rubbish myself," muttered Jo as she went to consult Hannah. The good soul was wide awake in a minute, and took the lead at once, assuring Jo that there was no need to worry. Everyone had scarlet fever, and if rightly treated, nobody died, all of which Jo believed, and felt much relieved as they went up to call Meg. "Now I'll tell you what we'll do," said Hannah when she had examined and questioned Beth. "We will have Dr. Bangs just to take a look at you, dear, and see that we start right. Then we'll send Amy off to Aunt March's for a spell to keep her out of harm's way, and one of you girls can stay at home and amuse Beth for a day or two." "I shall stay, of course. I'm oldest," began Meg, looking anxious and self-reproachful. "I shall, because it's my fault she is sick. I told Mother I'd do the errands, and I haven't," said Jo decidedly. "Which will you have, Beth? There ain't no need of but one," said Hannah. "Jo, please." And Beth leaned her head against her sister with a contented look, which effectually settled that point. "I'll go and tell Amy," said Meg, feeling a little hurt, yet rather relieved on the whole, for she did not like nursing, and Jo did. Dr. Bangs came, said Beth had symptoms of the fever, but thought she would have it lightly, though he looked sober over the Hummel story. Amy was ordered off at once, and provided with something to ward off danger, she departed in great state, with Joe and Laurie as escort. Beth did have the fever, and was much sicker than anyone but Hannah and the doctor suspected. The girls knew nothing about illness, and Mr. Lawrence was not allowed to see her, so Hannah had everything all her own way, and busy Dr. Bangs did his best, but left a good deal to the excellent nurse. Meg stayed at home, lest she should infect the Kings, and kept house, feeling very anxious and a little guilty when she wrote letters in which no mention was made of Beth's illness. She could not think it right to deceive her mother, but she had been bidden to mind Hannah, and Hannah wouldn't hear of Mrs. March being told and worried just for such a trifle. Jo devoted herself to Beth day and night. Not a hard task, for Beth was very patient, and bore her pain uncomplainingly as long as she could control herself. But there came a time when, during the fever fits, she began to talk in a hoarse, broken voice, to play on the coverlet as if on her beloved piano, and try to sing with a throat so swollen that there was no music left. A time when she did not know the familiar faces around her, but addressed them by wrong names and called imploringly for her mother. Then Jo grew frightened. Meg begged to be allowed to write the truth, and even Hannah said she would think of it, though there was no danger yet. A letter from Washington added to their trouble, for Mr. March had had a relapse and could not think of coming home for a long while. How dark the days seemed now, how sad and lonely the house, and how heavy were the hearts of the sisters as they worked and waited, while the shadow of death hovered over the once happy home. Meanwhile Beth lay on her bed, hour after hour, tossing to and fro, with incoherent words on her lips, or sank into a heavy sleep which brought her no refreshment. Dr. Bangs came twice a day. Hannah sat up at night. Meg kept a telegram in her desk all ready to send off at any minute, and Jo never stirred from Beth's side. The 1st of December was a wintry day indeed to them, for a bitter wind blew, snow fell fast, and the year seemed getting ready for its death. When Dr. Bangs came that morning, he looked long at Beth, held the hot hand in both of his own a minute, and laid it gently down, saying in a low tone to Hannah, "If Mrs. March can leave her husband, she'd better be sent for." Hannah nodded without speaking, for her lips twitched nervously. Meg dropped down into a chair as the strength seemed to go out of her limbs at the sound of those words. And Jo, after standing with a pale face for a minute, ran to the parlor, snatched up the telegram, and throwing on her things rushed out into the storm. She was soon back, and while noiselessly taking off her cloak, Laurie came in with a letter saying that Mr. March was mending again. Jo read it thankfully, but the heavy weight did not seem lifted off her heart, and her face was so full of misery that Laurie asked quickly, "What is it? Beth worse?" "I've sent for Mother," said Jo, tugging at her rubber boots with a tragic expression. "Good for you, Jo. Did you do it on your own responsibility?" asked Laurie as he seated her in the hall chair and took off the rebellious boots, seeing how her hand shook. "No, the doctor told us to." "Oh, Jo, it's not as bad as that," cried Laurie with a startled face. "Yes, it is. She doesn't know us. She doesn't even talk about the flocks of green doves, as she calls the vine leaves on the wall. She doesn't look like my Beth, and there's nobody to help us bear it. Mother and Father both gone, and God seems so far away I can't find him." As the tears streamed down poor Jo's cheeks, she stretched out her hand in a helpless sort of way, as if groping in the dark, and Laurie took it in his, whispering as well as he could with a lump in his throat, "I'm here. Hold on to me, Jo, dear." She could not speak, but she did hold on, and the warm grasp of the friendly human hand comforted her sore heart, and seemed to lead her nearer to the divine arm which alone could uphold her in her trouble. Laurie longed to say something tender and comfortable, but no fitting words came to him. So he stood silent, gently stroking her bent head as her mother used to do. It was the best thing he could have done, far more soothing than the most eloquent words, for Jo felt the unspoken sympathy, and in the silence learned the sweet solace which affection administers to sorrow. Soon she dried the tears which had relieved her, and looked up with a grateful face.
"Thank you, Laurie. I'm better now. I don't feel so forlorn, and will try to bear it if it comes."
"Poor girl, you're worn out. It isn't like you to be forlorn. Stop a bit. I'll hearten you up."
"What is it?"
cried Jo, forgetting her woes for a minute in her wonder.
"I telegraphed to your mother yesterday, and Brooke answered she'd come at once, and she'll be here tonight and everything will be all right. Aren't you glad I did it?"
Laurie spoke very fast and turned red and excited all in a minute, for he had kept his plot a secret for fear of disappointing the girls or harming Beth. Jo grew quite white, flew out of her chair, and the moment he stopped speaking she electrified him by throwing her arms round his neck and crying out with a joyful cry,
"Oh, Laurie! Oh, Mother! I am so glad!"
She did not weep again, but laughed hysterically, and trembled and clung to her friend as if she was a little bewildered by the sudden news. Everyone rejoiced but Beth. She lay in that heavy stupor, alike unconscious of hope and joy, doubt and danger. It was a piteous sight. The once rosy face so changed and vacant, the once busy hands so weak and wasted, the once smiling lips quite dumb, and the once pretty, well-kept hair scattered rough and tangled on the pillow. All day she lay so, only rousing now and then to mutter, "Water," with lips so parched they could hardly shape the word. All day Jo and Meg hovered over her, watching, waiting, hoping, and trusting in God and Mother. And all day the snow fell, the bitter wind raged, and the hours dragged slowly by. But night came at last, and every time the clock struck, the sisters, still sitting on either side of the bed, looked at each other with brightening eyes, for each hour brought help nearer. The doctor had been in to say some change for better or worse would probably take place about midnight, at which time he would return. It was past 2 when Jo, who stood at the window thinking how dreary the world looked in its winding sheet of snow, heard a movement by the bed, and turning quickly, saw Meg kneeling before their mother's easy-chair with her face hidden. A dreadful fear passed coldly over Jo as she thought,
"Beth is dead, and Meg is afraid to tell me."
She was back at her post in an instant, and to her excited eyes a great change seemed to have taken place. The fever flush and the look of pain were gone, and the beloved little face looked so pale and peaceful in its utter repose that Jo felt no desire to weep or to lament. Leaning low over this dearest of her sisters, she kissed the damp forehead with her heart on her lips, and softly whispered,
"Goodbye, my Beth. Goodbye."
As if waked by the stir, Hannah started out of her sleep, hurried to the bed, looked at Beth, felt her hands, listened at her lips, and then throwing her apron over her head, sat down to rock to and fro, exclaiming under her breath,
"Fever's turn. She's sleeping natural, her skin's damp, and she breathes easy. Praise be given. Oh, my goodness me."
Before the girls could believe the happy truth, the doctor came to confirm it. He was a homely man, but they thought his face quite heavenly when he smiled and said with a fatherly look at them,
"Yes, my dears, I think the little girl will pull through this time. Keep the house quiet, let her sleep, and when she wakes, give her—"
What they were to give neither heard, for both crept into the dark hall, and sitting on the stairs held each other close, rejoicing with hearts too full for words. When they went back to be kissed and cuddled by faithful Hannah, they found Beth lying as she used to, with her cheek pillowed on her hand, the dreadful pallor gone, and breathing quietly, as if just fallen asleep.
"If Mother would only come now,"
said Jo as the winter night began to wane.
"See,"
said Meg, coming up with a white, half-opened rose.
"I thought this would hardly be ready to lay in Beth's hand tomorrow if she went away from us. But it has blossomed in the night, and now I mean to put it in my vase here, so that when the darling wakes, the first thing she sees will be the little rose and Mother's face."
Never had the sun risen so beautifully, and never had the world seemed so lovely as it did to the heavy eyes of Meg and Joe as they looked out in the early morning when their long, sad vigil was done. "It looks like a fairy world," said Meg, smiling to herself as she stood behind the curtain watching the dazzling sight. "Hark!" cried Joe, starting to her feet. Yes, there was a sound of bells at the door below, a cry from Hannah, and then Laurie's voice saying in a joyful whisper, "Girls, she's come! She's come!" I don't think I have any words in which to tell the meeting of the mother and daughters. Such hours are beautiful to live, but very hard to describe. So I will leave it to the imagination of my readers, merely saying that the house was full of genuine happiness, and that Meg's tender hope was realized. For when Beth woke from that long, healing sleep, the first two objects on which her eyes fell were the little rose and Mother's face. Too weak to wonder at anything, she only smiled and nestled close into the loving arms about her, feeling that the hungry longing was satisfied at last. Then she slept again, and the girls waited upon their mother, for she would not unclasp the thin hand which clung to hers even in sleep. Hannah had dished up an astonishing breakfast for the traveler, finding it impossible to vent her excitement in any other way, and Meg and Joe fed their mother like dutiful young storks, while they listened to her whispered account of Father's state, Mr. Brooks' promise to stay and nurse him, the delays which the storm occasioned on the homeward journey, and the unspeakable comfort Laurie's hopeful face had given her when she arrived, worn out with fatigue, anxiety, and cold. That evening, while Meg was writing to her father to report the traveler's safe arrival, Joe slipped upstairs into Beth's room, and finding her mother in her usual place, stood a minute twisting her fingers in her hair, with a worried gesture and an undecided look. "What is it, dearie?" asked Mrs. March, holding out her hand with a face which invited confidence.
"I want to tell you something, Mother."
"About Meg?"
"How quickly you guessed. Yes, it's about her, and though it's a little thing, it fidgets me."
"Beth is asleep. Speak low and tell me all about it."
"Last summer," began Joe,
Meg left a pair of gloves over at the Lawrences', and only one was returned. We forgot all about it, till Laurie told me that Mr. Brooke had it. He kept it in his waistcoat pocket, and once it fell out, and Laurie joked him about it, and Mr. Brooke owned up that he liked Meg, but didn't dare say so, she was so young, and he so poor. Now, isn't it a dreadful state of things?"
"Do you think Meg cares for him?" asked Mrs. March with an anxious look.
"Mercy me! I don't know anything about love and such nonsense,"
cried Joe with a funny mixture of interest and contempt.
"In novels, the girls show it by starting and blushing, fainting away, growing thin, and acting like fools. Now, Meg does not do anything of the sort."
"Then you fancy that Meg is not interested in John?"
"Who?"
cried Joe, staring. "Mr. Brooke. I call him John now. We fell into the way of doing so at the hospital, and he likes it."
"Oh, dear, I know you'll take his part. He's been good to Father, and you won't send him away, but let Meg marry him if she wants to. Mean thing, to go petting Papa and helping you just to wheedle you into liking him."
And Joe pulled her hair again with a wrathful tweak. "My dear, don't get angry about it, and I will tell you how it happened. John went with me at Mr. Lawrence's request, and was so devoted to poor Father that we couldn't help getting fond of him. He was perfectly open and honorable about Meg, for he told us he loved her, but would earn a comfortable home before he asked her to marry him. He only wanted our leave to love her and work for her, and the right to make her love him if he could. He is a truly excellent young man, and we could not refuse to listen to him. But I will not consent to Meg's engaging herself so young."
"Of course not. It would be idiotic. I knew there was mischief brewing. I felt it, and now it's worse than I imagined. I just wish I could marry Meg myself and keep her safe in the family."
This odd arrangement made Mrs. March smile, but she said gravely, "Joe, I confide in you and don't wish you to say anything to Meg yet. When John comes back and I see them together, I can judge better of her feelings toward him."
"She'll see his in those handsome eyes that she talks about, and then it will be all up with her. She's got such a soft heart. It will melt like butter in the sun if anyone looks sentimentally at her. She read the short reports he sent more than she did your letters, and pinched me when I spoke of it, and likes brown eyes, and doesn't think John an ugly name. And she'll go and fall in love, and there's an end of peace and fun and cozy times together. I see it all. They'll go lovering around the house, and we shall have to dodge. Meg will be absorbed and no good to me any more. Brooke will scratch up a fortune somehow, carry her off, and make a hole in the family. And I shall break my heart, and everything will be abominably uncomfortable. Oh, dear me. Why aren't we all boys? Then there wouldn't be any bother.
Jo leaned her chin on her knees in a disconsolate attitude and shook her fist at the reprehensible John.
I hate to see things going all crisscross and getting all snarled to, when a pull here and a snip there would straighten it out. I wish wearing flat irons on our heads would keep us from going up. But buds will be roses and kittens cats, more's the pity.
"What's that about flat irons and cats?" asked Meg as she crept into the room with the finished letter in her hand.
Only one of my stupid speeches. I'm going to be... Come, Peggy,
said Jo, unfolding herself like an animated puzzle. "Quite right, and beautifully written. Please add that I send my love to John," said Mrs. March as she glanced over the letter and gave it back.
"Do you call him John?"
asked Meg, smiling, with her innocent eyes looking down into her mother's. "Yes, he has been like a son to us, and we are very fond of him," replied Mrs. March, returning the look with a keen one.
"I'm glad of that. He is so lonely. Good night, Mother dear. It is so inexpressibly comfortable to have you here,"
was Meg's answer. The kiss her mother gave her was a very tender one, and as she went away Mrs. March said, with a mixture of satisfaction and regret, "She does not love John yet, but will soon learn to." Jo's face was a study the next day, for the secret rather weighed upon her, and she found it hard not to look mysterious and important. Meg observed this, but did not trouble herself to make inquiries, for she had learned that the best way to manage Jo was by the law of contraries, so she felt sure of being told everything if she did not ask. She was rather surprised, therefore, when the silence remained unbroken, and Jo assumed a patronizing air, which decidedly aggravated Meg, who in her turn assumed an air of dignified reserve and devoted herself to her mother. This left Jo to her own devices, for Mrs. March had taken her place as nurse, and bade her rest, exercise, and amuse herself after her long confinement. Amy being gone, Laurie was her only refuge, and much as she enjoyed his society, she rather dreaded him just then, for he was an incorrigible tease, and she feared he would coax her secret from her. She was quite right, for the mischief-loving lad no sooner suspected a mystery than he set himself to find it out, and led Jo a trying life of it. He wheedled, bribed, ridiculed, threatened, and scolded, affected indifference, that he might surprise the truth from her, declared he knew, then that he didn't care, and at last, by dint of perseverance, he satisfied himself that it concerned Meg and Mr. Brooke. Feeling indignant that he was not taken into his tutor's confidence, he set his wits to work to devise some proper retaliation for the slight. Meg, meanwhile, had apparently forgotten the matter, and was absorbed in preparations for her father's return. But all of a sudden a change seemed to come over her, and for a day or two she was quite unlike herself. She started when spoken to, blushed when looked at, was very quiet, and sat over her sewing with a timid, troubled look on her face. To her mother's inquiries she answered that she was quite well, and Jo's she silenced by begging to be alone.
She feels it in the air. Love, I mean, and she's going very fast. She's got most of the symptoms. Is twittery and cross. Doesn't eat. Lies awake and mopes in corners. I caught her singing that song he gave her, and once she said, "John," as you do, and then turned as red as a poppy. "Whatever shall we do?"
said Jo, looking ready for any measures, however violent. "Nothing but wait. Let her alone, be kind and patient, and Father's coming will settle everything," replied her mother.
Here's a note to you, Meg, all sealed up. How odd. Laurie never seals mine,
said Joe next day. Mrs. March and Joe were deep in their own affairs when a sound from Meg made them look up to see her staring at her note with a frightened face. "My child, what is it?" cried her mother, running to her, while Joe tried to take the paper which had done the mischief. "It's all a mistake. He didn't send it. Oh, Joe, how could you do it?" And Meg hid her face in her hands, crying as if her heart was quite broken.
Me? I've done nothing. What's she talking about?
Cried Joe, bewildered. Meg's mild eyes kindled with anger as she pulled a crumpled note from her pocket and threw it at Joe, saying reproachfully, "You wrote it, and that bad boy helped you. How could you be so rude, so mean and cruel to us both?" Joe hardly heard her, for she and her mother were reading the note, which was written in a peculiar hand. "My dearest Margaret, I can no longer restrain my passion and must know my fate before I return. I dare not tell your parents yet, but I think they would consent if they knew that we adored one another. Mr. Lawrence will help me to some good place, and then, my sweet girl, you will make me happy. I implore you to say nothing to your family yet, but to send one word of hope through Laurie to your devoted John."
"Oh, the little villain! That's the way he meant to pay me for keeping my word to Mother. I'll give him a hearty scolding and bring him over to beg pardon,"
cried Joe, burning to execute immediate justice. But her mother held her back, saying with a look she seldom wore, "Stop, Joe. You must clear yourself first. You have played so many pranks that I am afraid you have had a hand in this."
"On my word, Mother, I haven't. I never saw that note before. I don't know anything about it, as true as I live,"
said Joe so earnestly that they believed her.
"If I had taken a part in it, I'd have done it better than this, and have written a sensible note. I should think you'd have known Mr. Brooke wouldn't write such stuff as that," she added, scornfully tossing down the paper. "It's like his writing," faltered Meg, comparing it with the note in her hand. "Oh, Meg, you didn't answer it," cried Mrs. March quickly. "Yes, I did." And Meg hid her face again, overcome with shame. "Here's a scrape. Do let me bring that wicked boy over to explain and be lectured. I can't rest till I get hold of him." And Joe made for the door again. "Hush! Let me manage this, for it is worse than I thought. Margaret, tell me the whole story," commanded Mrs. March, sitting down by Meg, yet keeping hold of Joe, lest she should fly off. "I received the first letter from Laurie, who didn't look as if he knew anything about it," began Meg without looking up. "I was worried at first and meant to tell you. Then I remembered how you liked Mr. Brooke, so I thought you wouldn't mind if I kept my little secret for a few days. Forgive me, Mother. I'm paid for my silliness now. I never can look him in the face again." "What did you say to him?" asked Mrs. March. "I only said I was too young to do anything about it yet, that I didn't wish to have secrets from you, and he must speak to Father. I was very grateful for his kindness and would be his friend, but nothing more for a long while." Mrs. March smiled as if well pleased, and Joe clapped her hands, exclaiming with a laugh, "You are almost equal to Caroline Percy, who is a pattern of prudence. Tell on, Meg. What did he say to that?" "He writes in a different way entirely, telling me that he never sent any love letter at all, and is very sorry that my roguish sister Joe should take such liberties with our names. It's very kind and respectful, but think how dreadful for me." Meg leaned against her mother, looking the image of despair, and Joe tramped about the room calling Laurie names. All of a sudden she stopped, caught up the notes, and after looking at them closely said decidedly, "I don't believe Brooke ever saw either of these letters. Laurie wrote both, and keeps yours to crow over me with because I wouldn't tell him my secret." "Don't have any secrets, Joe. Tell it to Mother and keep out of trouble, as I should have done," said Meg warningly. "Bless you, child. Mother told me." "That will do, Joe. I'll comfort Meg while you go and get Laurie. I shall sift the matter to the bottom and put a stop to such pranks at once." Away ran Joe, and Mrs. March gently told Meg Mr. Brooke's real feelings. "Now, dear, what are your own? Do you love him enough to wait till he can make a home for you, or will you keep yourself quite free for the present?" "I've been so scared and worried. I don't want to have anything to do with lovers for a long while. Perhaps never," answered Meg petulantly.
If John doesn't know anything about this nonsense, don't tell him, and make Joe and Laurie hold their tongues. I won't be deceived and plagued and made a fool of. It's a shame." Seeing that Meg's usually gentle temper was roused and her pride hurt by this mischievous joke, Mrs. March soothed her by promises of entire silence and great discretion for the future. The instant Laurie's step was heard in the hall, Meg fled into the study, and Mrs. March received the culprit alone. Joe had not told him why he was wanted, fearing he wouldn't come, but he knew the minute he saw Mrs. March's face, and stood twirling his hat with a guilty air which convicted him at once. Joe was dismissed, but chose to march up and down the hall like a sentinel, having some fear that the prisoner might bolt. The sound of voices in the parlor rose and fell for half an hour, but what happened during that interview the girls never knew. When they were called in, Laurie was standing by their mother with such a penitent face that Joe forgave him on the spot, but did not think it wise to betray the fact. Meg received his humble apology, and was much comforted by the assurance that Brooke knew nothing of the joke. "I'll never tell him to my dying day. Wild horses shan't drag it out of me, so you'll forgive me, Meg, and I'll do anything to show how out-and-out sorry I am," he added, looking very much ashamed of himself. "I'll try, but it was a very ungentlemanly thing to do. I didn't think you could be so sly and malicious, Laurie," replied Meg, trying to hide her maidenly confusion under a gravely reproachful air. "It was altogether abominable, and I don't deserve to be spoken to for a month. But you will, though, won't you?" And Laurie folded his hands together with such an imploring gesture, as he spoke in his irresistibly persuasive tone, that it was impossible to frown upon him in spite of his scandalous behavior. Meg pardoned him, and Mrs. March's grave face relaxed in spite of her efforts to keep sober when she heard him declare that he would atone for his sins by all sorts of penances and abase himself like a worm before the injured damsel. There everyone thought the matter ended, and the little cloud blown over. But the mischief was done, for though others forgot it, Meg remembered. She never alluded to a certain person, but she thought of him a good deal, dreamed dreams more than ever. And once Joe, rummaging her sister's desk for stamps, found a bit of paper scribbled over with the words, "Mrs. John Brooke," whereat she groaned tragically and cast it into the fire, feeling that Laurie's prank had hastened the evil day for her. Like sunshine after storm were the peaceful weeks which followed. The invalids improved rapidly, and Mr. March began to talk of returning early in the new year. Beth was soon able to lie on the study sofa all day, amusing herself with the well-beloved cats at first, and in time with Doll's sewing, which had fallen sadly behind. Her once active limbs were so stiff and feeble that Joe took her a daily airing about the house in her strong arms. Now and then in this workaday world, things do happen in the delightful storybook fashion, and what a comfort that is. Christmas Day had come round again, and half an hour after everyone had said they were so happy they could only hold one drop more, the drop came. Laurie opened the parlor door and popped his head in very quietly. He might just as well have turned a somersault and uttered an Indian war whoop, for his face was so full of suppressed excitement, and his voice so treacherously joyful that everyone jumped up, though he only said in a queer, breathless voice, "Here's another Christmas present for the March family." Before the words were well out of his mouth, he was whisked away somehow, and in his place appeared a tall man, muffled up to the eyes, leaning on the arm of another tall man, who tried to say something and couldn't. Of course there was a general stampede, and for several minutes everybody seemed to lose their wits, for the strangest things were done, and no one said a word. Mr. March became invisible in the embrace of 4 pairs of loving arms. Jo disgraced herself by nearly fainting away, and had to be doctored by Laurie in the china closet. Mr. Brooke kissed Meg entirely by mistake, as he somewhat incoherently explained. And Amy, the dignified, tumbled over a stool, and never stopping to get up, hugged and cried over her father's boots in the most touching manner. Mrs. March was the first to recover herself, and held up her hand with the warning, "Hush, remember Beth." But it was too late. The study door flew open, the little red wrapper appeared on the threshold, joy put strength into the feeble limbs, and Beth ran straight into her father's arms. Never mind what happened just after that. for the full hearts overflowed, washing away the bitterness of the past and leaving only the sweetness of the present. There never was such a Christmas dinner as they had that day. Mr. Lawrence and his grandson dined with them, also Mr. Brooke, at whom Joe glowered darkly to Laurie's infinite amusement. They drank healths, told stories, sang songs, reminisced, as the old folks say, and had a thoroughly good time. A sleigh ride had been planned, but the girls would not leave their father, so the guests departed early, and as twilight gathered, the happy family sat together round the fire.
Just a year ago, we were groaning over the dismal Christmas we expected to have. Do you remember?
Asked Joe, breaking a short pause which had followed a long conversation about many things.
Rather a pleasant year on the whole,
said Meg, smiling at the fire and congratulating herself on having treated Mr. Brooke with dignity.
I think it's been a pretty hard one,
observed Amy.
I'm glad it's over, because we've got you back,
whispered Beth, who sat on her father's knee. Rather a rough road for you to travel, my little pilgrims, especially the latter part of it. But you have got on bravely, and I think the burdens are in a fair way to tumble off very soon, said Mr. March, looking with fatherly satisfaction at the 4 young faces gathered round him.
How do you know? Did Mother tell you?
Asked Joe. Not much. Straws show which way the wind blows, and I've made several discoveries today.
Oh, tell us what they are,
cried Meg, who sat beside him. Here is one. And taking up the hand which lay on the arm of his chair, he pointed to the roughened forefinger, a burn on the back, and 2 or 3 little hard spots on the palm. I remember a time when this hand was white and smooth, and your first care was to keep it so. It was very pretty then, but to me it is much prettier now, for in these seeming blemishes I read a little history. A burnt offering has been made of vanity. This hardened palm has earned something better than blisters, and I'm sure the sewing done by these pricked fingers will last a long time, so much goodwill went into the stitches. Meg, my dear, I value the womanly skill which keeps home happy more than white hands or fashionable accomplishments. I'm proud to shake this good, industrious little hand, and hope I shall not soon be asked to give it away. If Meg had wanted a reward for hours of patient labor, she received it in the hearty pressure of her father's hand and the approving smile he gave her.
What about Joe? Please say something nice, for she has tried so hard and been so very, very good to me,
said Beth in her father's ear. He laughed and looked across at the tall girl who sat opposite, with an unusually mild expression in her brown face. In spite of the curly crop, I don't see the son Joe whom I left a year ago, said Mr. March. I see a young lady who pins her collar straight, laces her boots neatly, and neither whistles, talks slang, nor lies on the rug as she used to do. Her face is rather thin and pale just now with watching and anxiety, but I like to look at it, for it has grown gentler, and her voice is lower. She doesn't bounce, but moves quietly, and takes care of a certain little person in a motherly way which delights me. I rather miss my wild girl, but if I get a strong, helpful, tender-hearted woman in her place, I shall feel quite satisfied. I don't know whether the shearing sobered our black sheep, but I do know that in all Washington I couldn't find anything beautiful enough to be bought with the $25 which my good girl sent me. Joe's keen eyes were rather dim for a minute, and her thin face grew rosy in the firelight as she received her father's praise, feeling that she did deserve a portion of it.
Now, Beth,
said Amy, longing for her turn, but ready to wait. There's so little of her, I'm afraid to say much, for fear she will slip away altogether, though she is not so shy as she used to be, began their father cheerfully. But recollecting how nearly he had lost her, he held her close, saying tenderly with her cheek against his own, I've got you safe, my Beth, and I'll keep you so, please God. After a minute's silence, he looked down at Amy, who sat on the cricket at his feet, and said with a caress of the shining hair, I observed that Amy took drumsticks at dinner, ran errands for her mother all the afternoon, gave Meg her place tonight, and has waited on everyone with patience and good humor. I also observe that she does not fret much nor look in the glass, so I conclude that she has learned to think of other people more and of herself less, and has decided to try and mold her character as carefully as she molds her little clay figures. I'm glad of this, for though I should be very proud of a graceful statue made by her, I shall be infinitely prouder of a lovable daughter with a talent for making life beautiful to herself and others."
"What are you thinking of, Beth?"
asked Jo when Amy had thanked her father.
"I read in Pilgrim's Progress today how, after many troubles, Christian and Hopeful came to a pleasant green meadow where lilies bloomed all the year round, and there they rested happily, as we do now, before they went on to their journey's end,"
answered Beth, adding as she slipped out of her father's arms and went slowly to the instrument,
"It's singing time now, and I want to be in my old place. I'll try to sing the song of the shepherd boy which the pilgrims heard. I made the music for Father because he likes the verses."
So, sitting at the dear little piano, Beth softly touched the keys, and in the sweet voice they had never thought to hear again, sang to her own accompaniment the quaint hymn which was a singularly fitting song for her. "He that is down need fear no fall. He that is low no pride. He that is humble ever shall have God to be his guide. I am content with what I have, little be it or much, and Lord, contentment still I crave, because thou savest such. Fullness to them a burden is that go on pilgrimage. Here little, and hereafter bliss is best from age to age." Like bees swarming after their queen, mother and daughters hovered about Mr. March the next day, neglecting everything to look at, wait upon, and listen to the new invalid, who was in a fair way to be killed by kindness. As he sat propped up in a big chair by Beth's sofa, with the other three close by, and Hannah popping in her head now and then to peek at the dear man, nothing seemed needed to complete their happiness. But something was needed, and the elder ones felt it, though none confessed the fact. Mr. and Mrs. March looked at one another with an anxious expression as their eyes followed Meg. Jo had sudden fits of sobriety, and was seen to shake her fist at Mr. Brooke's umbrella, which had been left in the hall. Meg was absent-minded, shy, and silent, started when the bell rang, and colored when John's name was mentioned. Amy said,
"Everyone seemed waiting for something and couldn't settle down, which was queer since Father was safe at home."
And Beth innocently wondered why their neighbors didn't run over as usual. Laurie went by in the afternoon, and seeing Meg at the window seemed suddenly possessed with a melodramatic fit, for he fell down upon one knee in the snow, beat his breast, tore his hair, and clasped his hands imploringly, as if begging some boon. And when Meg told him to behave himself and go away, he wrung imaginary tears out of his handkerchief, and staggered round the corner as if in utter despair.
"What does the goose mean?"
said Meg, laughing and trying to look unconscious.
"He's showing you how your John will go on by and by. Touching, isn't it?"
answered Jo scornfully.
"Don't say my John. It isn't proper or true."
But Meg's voice lingered over the words as if they sounded pleasant to her.
"Please don't plague me, Jo. I've told you I don't care much about him, and there isn't to be anything said, but we are all to be friendly and go on as before."
Meg rose as she spoke, and was just going to make a dignified exit, when a step in the hall made her fly into her seat, and begin to sew as fast as if her life depended on finishing that particular seam in time. Jo smothered a laugh at the sudden change, and when someone gave a modest tap, opened the door with a grim aspect which was anything but hospitable. "Good afternoon. I came to get my umbrella, that is, to see how your father finds himself today," said Mr. Brooke, getting a trifle confused as his eye went from one telltale face to the other.
"It's very well, he's in the rack. I'll get him and tell it you are here."
And having jumbled her father and the umbrella well together in her reply, Jo slipped out of the room. But the instant she vanished, Meg began to sidle toward the door, murmuring,
"Mother will like to see you. Pray sit down. I'll call her."
"Don't go. Are you afraid of me, Margaret?" And Mr. Brooke looked so hurt that Meg thought she must have done something very rude. Anxious to appear friendly and at her ease, she put out her hand with a confiding gesture, and said gratefully,
"How can I be afraid when you have been so kind to Father? I only wish I could thank you for it."
"Shall I tell you how?" asked Mr. Brooke, holding the small hand fast in both his own, and looking down at Meg with so much love in the brown eyes that her heart began to flutter, and she both longed to run away and to stop and listen.
"Oh, no, please don't. I'd rather not,"
she said, trying to withdraw her hand and looking frightened in spite of her denial. "I won't trouble you. I only want to know if you care for me a little, Meg. I love you so much, dear," added Mr. Brooke tenderly. This was the moment for a calm, proper speech, but Meg didn't make it. She hung her head and answered,
"I don't know,"
so softly that John had to stoop down to catch the foolish little reply. He seemed to think it was worth the trouble, for he smiled to himself as if quite satisfied, pressed the plump hand gratefully, and said in his most persuasive tone, "Will you try and find out? I want to know so much, for I can't go to work with any heart until I learn whether I'm to have my reward in the end or not."
"I am too young,"
faltered Meg, wondering why she was so fluttered, yet rather enjoying it. "I'll wait, and in the meantime, you could be learning to like me. Would it be a very hard lesson, dear?"
"Not if I choose to learn it, but—"
"Please choose to learn, Meg. I love to teach, and this is easier than German," broke in John, getting possession of the other hand, so that she had no way of hiding her face as he bent to look into it. His tone was properly beseeching, but stealing a shy look at him, Meg saw that his eyes were merry as well as tender, and that he wore a satisfied smile of one who had no doubt of his success. This nettled her. She felt excited and strange, and not knowing what else to do, followed a capricious impulse, and withdrawing her hand, said petulantly,
"I don't choose. Please go away and let me be."
Poor Mr. Brooke looked as if his lovely castle in the air was tumbling about his ears, for he had never seen Meg in such a mood before, and it rather bewildered him. "Do you really mean that?" he asked anxiously, following her as she walked away.
"Yes, I do. I don't want to be worried about such things. Father says I needn't. It's too soon, and I'd rather not."
"Mayn't I hope you'll change your mind by and by? I'll wait and say nothing till you have had more time. Don't play with me, Meg. I didn't think that of you."
"Don't think of me at all. I'd rather you wouldn't,"
said Meg, taking a naughty satisfaction in trying her lover's patience and her own power. He was grave and pale now, and looked decidedly more like the novel heroes whom she admired, but he neither slapped his forehead nor tramped about the room as they did. He just stood looking at her so wistfully, so tenderly, that she found her heart relenting in spite of her. What would have happened next I cannot say if Aunt March had not come hobbling in at this interesting minute. The old lady couldn't resist her longing to see her nephew, for she had met Laurie as she took her airing, and hearing of Mr. March's arrival drove straight out to see him. The family were all busy in the back part of the house, and she had made her way quietly in, hoping to surprise them. She did surprise two of them so much that Meg started as if she had seen a ghost, and Mr. Brooke vanished into the study. "Bless me! What's all this?" cried the old lady with a rap of her cane as she glanced from the pale young gentleman to the scarlet young lady.
"It's Father's friend. I'm so surprised to see you,"
stammered Meg, feeling that she was in for a lecture now. "That's evident," returned Aunt March, sitting down. "But what is Father's friend saying to make you look like a peony? There's mischief going on, and I insist upon knowing what it is," with another rap.
"We were merely talking. Mr. Brooke came for his umbrella,"
began Meg, wishing that Mr. Brooke and the umbrella were safely out of the house. "Brooke? That boy's tutor? Ah, I understand now. I know all about it. Joe blundered into a wrong message in one of your father's letters, and I made her tell me. You haven't gone and accepted him, child," cried Aunt March, looking scandalized.
"Hush! He'll hear. Shan't I call Mother?"
said Meg, much troubled. "Not yet. I've something to say to you, and I must free my mind at once. Tell me, do you mean to marry this cook? If you do, not 1 penny of my money ever goes to you. Remember that, and be a sensible girl," said the old lady impressively. Now Aunt March possessed in perfection the art of rousing the spirit of opposition in the gentlest people, and enjoyed doing it. The best of us have a spice of perversity in us, especially when we are young and in love. If Aunt March had begged Meg to accept John Brooke, she would probably have declared she couldn't think of it. But as she was peremptorily ordered not to like him, she immediately made up her mind that she would. Inclination as well as perversity made the decision easy, and being already much excited, Meg opposed the old lady with unusual spirit.
"I shall marry whom I please, Aunt March, and you can leave your money to anyone you like," she said, nodding her head with a resolute air.
"Highty-tighty, is that the way you take my advice, miss? You'll be sorry for it by and by, when you've tried love in a cottage and found it a failure."
"It can't be a worse one than some people find in big houses," retorted Meg.
"He knows you have rich relations, child. That's the secret of his liking, I suspect."
"Aunt March, how dare you say such a thing? John is above such meanness, and I won't listen to you a minute if you talk so," cried Meg indignantly, forgetting everything but the injustice of the old lady's suspicions. "My John wouldn't marry for money any more than I would. We are willing to work, and we mean to wait. I'm not afraid of being poor, for I've been happy so far, and I know I shall be with him because he loves me, and I—"
Meg stopped there, remembering all of a sudden that she hadn't made up her mind, that she had told her John to go away, and that he might be overhearing her inconsistent remarks. Aunt March was very angry, for she had set her heart on having her pretty niece make a fine match, and something in the girl's happy young face made the lonely old woman feel both sad and sour. "Well, I wash my hands of the whole affair. You are a willful child, and you've lost more than you know by this piece of folly. No, I won't stop. I'm disappointed in you, and haven't spirits to see your father now. Don't expect anything from me when you are married. Your Mr. Brooke's friends must take care of you. I'm done with you forever." And slamming the door in Meg's face, Aunt March drove off in high dudgeon. She seemed to take all the girl's courage with her, for when left alone, Meg stood a moment undecided whether to laugh or cry. Before she could make up her mind, she was taken possession of by Mr. Brooke, who said all in one breath, "I couldn't help hearing, Meg. Thank you for defending me, and Aunt March for proving that you do care for me a little bit."
"I didn't know how much till she abused you," began Meg.
"And I needn't go away, but may stay and be happy, may I, dear?" Here was another fine chance to make a crushing speech and a stately exit, but Meg never thought of doing either, and disgraced herself forever in Joe's eyes by meekly whispering, "Yes, John," and hiding her face on Mr. Brooke's waistcoat. 15 minutes after Aunt March's departure, Joe came softly downstairs, paused an instant at the parlor door, and hearing no sound within, nodded and smiled with a satisfied expression, saying to herself,
"She has seen him away, and the affair is settled. I'll go and hear the fun, and have a good laugh over it."
But poor Joe never got her laugh, for she was transfixed upon the threshold by a spectacle which held her there, staring with her mouth nearly as wide open as her eyes. Going in to exult over a fallen enemy and to praise a strong-minded sister for the banishment of an objectionable lover, it certainly was a shock to behold the aforesaid enemy serenely sitting on the sofa, with the strong-minded sister enthroned upon his knee and wearing an expression of the most abject submission. Joe gave a sort of gasp, as if a cold shower-bath had suddenly fallen upon her, for such an unexpected turning of the tables actually took her breath away. At the odd sound, the lovers turned and saw her. Meg jumped up, looking both proud and shy, but that man, as Joe called him, actually laughed and said coolly as he kissed the astonished newcomer, "Sister Joe, congratulate us." That was adding insult to injury. It was altogether too much, and making some wild demonstration with her hands, Joe vanished without a word. Rushing upstairs, she startled the invalids by exclaiming tragically as she burst into the room, "Oh, do somebody go down quick! John Brooke is acting dreadfully, and Meg likes it!" Mr. and Mrs. March left the room with speed, and casting herself upon the bed, Jo cried and scolded tempestuously as she told the awful news to Beth and Amy. The little girls, however, considered it a most agreeable and interesting event, and Jo got little comfort from them. So she went up to her refuge in the garret and confided her troubles to the rats. Nobody ever knew what went on in the parlor that afternoon, but a great deal of talking was done, and quiet Mr. Brooke astonished his friends by the eloquence and spirit with which he pleaded his suit, told his plans, and persuaded them to arrange everything just as he wanted it. The tea-bell rang before he had finished describing the paradise which he meant to earn for Meg, and he proudly took her in to supper, both looking so happy that Jo hadn't the heart to be jealous or dismal. Amy was very much impressed by John's devotion and Meg's dignity. Beth beamed at them from a distance, while Mr. and Mrs. March surveyed the young couple with such tender satisfaction that it was perfectly evident Aunt March was right in calling them as unworldly as a pair of babies. No one ate much, but everyone looked very happy, and the old room seemed to brighten up amazingly when the first romance of the family began there. Laurie came prancing in, overflowing with spirits, bearing a great bridal-looking bouquet for Mrs. John Brooke, and evidently laboring under the delusion that the whole affair had been brought about by his excellent management. "I knew Brooke would have it all his own way. He always does, for when he makes up his mind to accomplish anything, it's done though the sky falls," said Laurie when he had presented his offering and his congratulations. "Much obliged for that recommendation. I take it as a good omen for the future, and invite you to my wedding on the spot," answered Mr. Brooke, who felt at peace with all mankind, even his mischievous pupil. "I'll come if I'm at the ends of the earth, for the sight of Joe's face alone on that occasion will be worth a long journey. You don't look festive, ma'am. What's the matter?" asked Laurie, following her into a corner of the parlor, whither all had adjourned to greet Mr. Lawrence.
"I don't approve of the match, but I've made up my mind to bear it, and shall not say a word against it," said Jo solemnly. "You can't know how hard it is for me to give up Meg," she continued with a little quiver in her voice. "You don't give her up. You only go halves," said Laurie consolingly. "It never can be the same again. I've lost my dearest friend," sighed Jo. "You got me, anyhow. I'm not good for much, I know, but I'll stand by you, Jo, all the days of my life. Upon my word I will." And Laurie meant what he said. "I know you will, and I'm ever so much obliged. You are always a great comfort to me, Laurie," returned Jo, gratefully shaking hands. "Well, now, don't be dismal, there's a good fellow. It's all right, you see. Meg is happy. Brooke will fly round and get settled immediately. Grandpa will attend to him, and it will be very jolly to see Meg in her own little house. We'll have capital times after she is gone, for I shall be through college before long, and then we'll go abroad on some nice trip or other. Wouldn't that console you?" "I rather think it would, but there's no knowing what may happen in 3 years," said Jo thoughtfully. "That's true. Don't you wish you could take a look forward and see where we shall all be then?" "I do," returned Laurie. "I think not, for I might see something sad, and everyone looks so happy now. I don't believe they could be much improved." And Jo's eyes went slowly round the room, brightening as they looked, for the prospect was a pleasant one. Father and mother sat together, quietly reliving the first chapter of the romance which for them began some 20 years ago. Amy was drawing the lovers, who sat apart in a beautiful world of their own, the light of which touched their faces with a grace the little artist could not copy. Beth lay on her sofa, talking cheerily with Mr. Lawrence, who held her little hand as if he felt that it possessed the power to lead him along the peaceful way she walked. Jo lounged in her favorite low seat, with the grave, quiet look which best became her, and Laurie, leaning on the back of her chair, his chin on a level with her curly head, smiled with his friendliest aspect, and nodded at her in the long glass which reflected them both.